Welcome. I'd like to welcome you to our second program in our Foundation's Arts and Humanities Spring Series. I'm Charlotte Brow. I serve as a volunteer director of the Foundation's Arts and Humanities Committee, and we have a number of our committee members here tonight. Just glad to see you. We're glad to have you this evening. We have a treat for you. We get to learn the story of a nationally acclaimed folk artist, Vollis Simpson, and the park that was created to display his kinetic sculptures or magical whirligigs. Next week, we want you to come back and join us for a historic topic. Tommy Jarrett, many of you know him, will present the Vice Presidency from John to Camilla with a few stops in between. I like that title. I did want to recognize just a couple of people in the audience tonight before we get started. And first of all, we are always delighted to see President Patty Pfeiffer here. She has been such a support of our programs. We appreciate you coming. And also, if I hope he's in here, but I'm not sure I see him, but Roy Palmer is the executive director of the Whirligig Park, and he has come as well as Caroline Hill, and they will be selling books. The book is Vollis Simpson, creator of the Whirligigs, and they'll be in the atrium after the program if you'd like them, and of course Keith could sign those for you. So tonight, to start the presentation, we'll have we've got two speakers. We have Kimberly Van Dyke is going to share about the park and its history. She is the director of the Planning and Community Revitalization Department for the City of Wilson. Ms. Van Dyke has over 28 years experience in downtown development, neighborhood business, district development, and community development and planning. One of her most important projects was, of course, the completion of the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park, and it is amazing if you haven't been. It is a nationally acclaimed project that has brought tens of millions in investment to the historic downtown Wilson. Wilson now, because of this, is set on a new arts and innovations path. She serves as the in-kind executive director for two nonprofit entities, Wilson Downtown Development Corporation and Wilson Downtown Properties Incorporated, that are in partnership with the City of Wilson to revitalize the historic downtown. She holds a master's degree in public administration, a graduate certificate in nonprofit and government leadership and administration, and undergraduate degrees in both organizational communications and German, all from Western Michigan University. Our second speaker is Keith Barnes, and he is a lifelong resident of Wilson. He is also the author of the book that's going to be available in the atrium. Barnes has worked primarily in the publishing and photography field, and 20 years of his career was with the Wilson Daily Times. He was a reporter there, a photographer, a columnist. Keith has published two other books, Whatever Happened to the Milkman, a compilation of about 250 of his columns in one book. And then he wrote one, The World's Greatest Tobacco Market, and we all know about Wilson's history in that. And this tobacco market ran from 1890 to 2000, so it has its pictorial and written history. He is busy continuing to preserve Wilson's history and the state's history by serving on the North Carolina Baseball Museum's Board of Directors. He's been there for 19 years and has served as president for the last 10. The museum is located in Wilson. You'll be able to ask Kimberly and Keith questions after their presentations. I hope you enjoy. Let's welcome our speakers.
Good evening. I'm Kimberly Van Dyke. As mentioned, I'm the Planning and Community Revitalization Director for the City of Wilson, and I'm also a board member of the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park and Museum nonprofit. And I have been with this project since its inception in 2009. And it is, I've been told I only have 20 minutes to speak, which is going to be very difficult for me because I'm very passionate about this place and this project. And so I'm very grateful to be here tonight and to share it with you all. Who here has been to the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park? All right. These are a bunch of smart people in this audience. Let's give them a round of applause for their intelligence. Yes. So this is a wonderful, beautiful place. And if you haven't been, or maybe even if you have, I've got a little video to show you. It's real short. Just gives you a little bit of an idea about the park. So. So as you can see, it's very whimsical, it's very magical, it's very colorful, it's a very beautiful, fun place to be. I'll talk a little bit more about why I'm so excited about it as we go along. But you might ask, what is the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park and Museum? What's the museum part? And of course, the Whirligig Park is a place, it's a public park, it's free and it's open to anyone. And we do consider the park itself an outdoor museum. But we also have a small museum and gift shop adjacent to the park that helps tell the story of the park. But what you might not know is that the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park and Museum is run by a nonprofit organization that was formed to own and maintain the Whirligigs into perpetuity. And it's a partnership with the city. So the city owns the land and they maintain the park itself, but they do not own the art and they do not maintain the art. And the nonprofit not only does that, but it also programs the park and they market the park. And so it's a partnership. And we do not get direct funding from the city or the county or the state, so we do rely on generous donations for the park. So I'll just have to put that plug in there. So that's who the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park and Museum are. I'll tell you a little bit of a background about the project. I'm going to try to condense, 10 years of work into about 4 minutes. But so it is a project that is in Wilson, if you don't know where that is. And Vollis Simpson was from Lucama, which is part of Wilson County. It's just outside of Wilson, and you folks might know that. And I'll talk Keith is going to talk a lot more about this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the artist. Sorry, I went backwards. So, Vollis Simpson. He spent almost his entire life in Lucama, and he was a rigger and a large equipment mover and a house mover, and so he was used to dealing with big pieces of things. And over the years, throughout his career, he sort of collected or acquired, you could say, just a lot of pieces and parts. And he put them all sort of outside of his workshop, which is at a rural crossroads in Lucama. And sometime near his retirement, his wife, Jean, said, Vollis, why don't you go do something with all that junk laying out there? Looks crazy out there. And I think she thought, you know, take it to the dump, take it to the recyclers, take it to the salvage yard. But that's not what Vollis did. And Keith is going to talk a lot more about this. Vollis took all of this scrap and all of these cast-off parts, and he created these massive, beautiful kinetic sculptures. And he just sort of put them in a field next to his workshop. He wasn't planning to become famous. He didn't consider himself an artist. He just did it because that's what he was driven to do. Like a lot of people that are makers like that. They're just driven to, they have this creative genius in their mind, and it just has to come out. And so that's what happened. And even before the internet, Vollis became sort of famous. People would stumble upon his whirligigs at this rural crossroads, and oh my word, what is this? And so over time, I'm going to let Keith tell this story, but over time, Vollis became kind of famous, commissioned, collected, and so you can find his whirligigs literally all over the world. And maybe I can't use this clicker. But this, I have a little video that just shows you a little bit about who Vollis was.
Well, I had a lot of material left over, and I didn't want to junk it or salvage it. And I put most of it out there to pasture. I worked 10 years putting that out there in the pasture every weekend for 10 years. Give or take a little bit on Sunday. Stayed with it, no help, period. The only help I had out there was well digging, dug a hole for the horses. It's 16 foot deep. I dug the rest of it with a damn hole digger. Everybody made fun of me and laughed at me and didn't pay them no damn mind. My daddy made us all work.
So there's more videos if you come to the museum and gift shop that you can watch while you're there, but that just kind of gives you a little bit of idea of kind of Vollis's character and his work ethic, which is amazing. So a little bit of history about Wilson. A lot of you may know this history, but of course Wilson was considered the world's greatest tobacco market. At one time there was more tobacco bought and sold in Wilson than any place in the entire world. And that drove the economy for probably about 100 years. And we once had a downtown full of these tobacco warehouses where people would come from all over the world during market season. They would descend on Wilson and they would buy tobacco. Over time, tobacco buying and selling changed. Of course, tobacco in many regards fell out of favor for various reasons. And this all happened about the same time that, you saw downtowns deteriorating across the United States. This is not unique to Wilson, right? We had interstates and we had suburban sprawl and we had shopping malls, and downtowns weren't cool anymore, right? And so downtown suffered, as did Wilson's. Before the announcement of the park, the investment in historic downtown Wilson was less than $1 million a year, public and private investment. And that would change over time. And this is the warehouse. This was actually the very first tobacco warehouse, correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, built in Wilson, called the Watson Warehouse. And it is, this is the site that the Whirligig Park is on now. And I didn't know this before we chose the park site, that it was the site of the first tobacco warehouse in Wilson that had changed the economic trajectory of the community for 100 years. We picked that site because it was a vacant piece of land where there weren't a lot of buildings around and you could get, a good wind coming through, so the Whirligigs would move. But then later, when I found out that the site that we built the park on was the site of the Watson Warehouse, and then to see the change in the economy and the trajectory of our community over time, just made me think that perhaps this site might have had, or has, a little bit of magic. And so that's the Watson Warehouse, and it was lost to fire in the 80s. So the park project. Let's talk a little bit about how the park project came about. So in 2008, 2009, the city of Wilson embarked on a comprehensive plan. And for those of you who aren't in the planning world and might not know that term, a comprehensive plan is a plan that a community comes up with to decide how it's going to hopefully grow into the future. And during this comprehensive planning process, a lot of the emphasis in Wilson was on redeveloping the center city. So our downtown, our historic districts, et cetera. And during one of the planning charrettes that were held, this idea, there were a lot of ideas that were generated. So the things that you would normally think of, like, oh, well, let's figure out a way to get people to buy these buildings and fix these buildings up. Let's figure out a way to support the businesses that are here so they can grow. Let's figure out a way to recruit more businesses. How do we get some of those cool apartments built in these old buildings that we see in other places? All those types of ideas. Let's fix the crumbling public infrastructure, right? All those types of things. So typical ideas, all good ideas, all things that should be done, all things that we are working on. Someone at this meeting had this idea. I think parks came up, and more green space, but someone had this idea of we should have a park, like a central park. And this central park should have all of those whirligigs that are out there in that field. They should be right here in this park, and that could be like Wilson's Eiffel Tower. It could be like the thing that draws people. And that gentleman was actually Burke Uzzell, who's a famous photographer who's actually originally from Dunn, North Carolina, has lived all over the world, came back to Wilson, and it was his idea. I can take no credit for this idea. And when I was going over all the plans of, how we revitalize downtown, I'm looking at they're all good ideas, but I was looking for the thing that could be the catalyst, right? Could be the out-of-the-box idea, the thing that could, kind of galvanize people. And to me, working in this field, I thought this idea of a park with Vollis'whirligigs was brilliant. And I thought it was so place-based, it was so unique, it was so about Wilson. If you think about these whirligigs, really the materials that they're made of probably all came from within a 100-mile radius of Wilson, right? So even just through the pieces and parts of these whirligigs, you can tell the history of this place. And the artist was from Wilson, and it was just such an interesting story to me. If you can't tell from my accent, I'm not from Wilson, North Carolina. I'm not from North Carolina. It's just a fascinating idea to me. And I knew that people in Wilson loved whirligigs. They even had a whirligig festival. But when this group of citizens came together to start galvanizing around, could we really make this happen? What would it take to make this happen? And kind of bouncing the idea around, a lot of people in the community thought it was a horrible idea. A horrible idea. They thought it was a stupid idea. They thought it was a crazy idea. And you have to remember, this was in 2009. In 2010, y'all remember what's happening in 2009, 2010? Economic downturn, right? People had lost their jobs. We had a 14% unemployment rate, right? These young people can't remember because they were babies. Maybe they weren't born yet. But most of you, the rest of you, remember that, right? And so people were saying, well, why in the world would you spend money on building a park full of art that's made out of junk when people have lost their jobs and when people can't pay for their prescriptions? And even the city manager and the city council was saying, Kimberly, I don't think we're going to spend money on art right now, all right? And so I said, okay, I get it. But what if you didn't have to raise the money? What do you mean? What if we raise the money? And so they said, well, if we don't have to pay for it, then you can work on it. And so me and the small group of citizens, we just kept plugging along, and we thought, we need a partner that's a little bit, it has a little bit more panache than just Wilson. Nothing against Wilson. But so we went up to the State Arts Council, and we got an audience with the staff there and the director, and kind of pitched our idea. And they loved the idea. The executive director of the Arts Council at the time was Mary Regan, and she almost started crying and said, I've been trying to figure out how to save these whirligigs for years, because if you noticed in the video, the whirligigs, when they were sitting out in Vollis's field, they were very rusted. They were very deteriorated. And so they loved the idea, and they said, if you pursue this, we're gonna be a partner. And that helped us a lot get the project launched and out into the world. But then there was another problem. These were Vollis's babies. They were his. He wasn't partying with them, right? he didn't want to part with them. He had no intention of that. But after some conversations and some relationship building, you know, I think Vollis realized that he was getting older. It was hard for him to keep them up. You have to get up and grease them on a regular basis. They were rusted, the paint was falling off and things like that. And so we came to an agreement with the Simpson family, and then we were kind of on our way. And I could talk for hours, I could talk for days about this, but I'm gonna keep going. So that's kind of how we got started. You can see on the top left, that's what the park lot looked like before we got started. The next one down is a picture of what the park looks like now, and the buildings behind there have been bought and revitalized, and businesses and apartments, et cetera, et cetera. The conservation process took a long time. I thought this project would take $3 million in 3 years. Well, it cost $10 million and took almost 8 years. And it was hard, but we stuck with it. And every time we hit a spot, I say it's a faith-based project because every time things would fall apart, something else would fall into place. And then we'd be off and running again. And, but the conservation of the whirligigs was what was so expensive and tedious, because these are huge, massive sculptures, and they are made out of all sorts of tiny bits and pieces. And if you have a piece or a part that you need to replace, well, it's not like you can just go buy it from Walmart. You know, you have to like search salvage yards across the United States sometimes to find the right part, and you can't just put any part on because it might throw off the entire balance of the whirligigs and then they won't work. So it was a very arduous process, and it was really cool to work on. And someone from this county right here, I don't know if any of you know Danny Price, but he helped a lot on the conservation. So props to Danny. So anyway, it was a wonderful project to work on. We stuck with it. It took us a long time, but in November of 2017, we had the grand opening of the park, and it was a beautiful day, and the wind wasn't blowing, and Vollis had passed away a couple years beforehand, but he was involved in the project the whole time he was alive. And then suddenly the wind started blowing, and I said to myself in my head, Vollis is here. And so project goals. Talk real quickly about that. I'm going in the wrong direction again. Project goals. So we had 3 goals as a group from the beginning. The first was to conserve and showcase the amazing work of Vollis Simpson. And if you don't know, his whirligigs are the official folk art of the state of North Carolina, and we have 30 of them. It's the largest collection of anywhere in the world. So that was our first and primary purpose. Our secondary purpose was to really create a community living room. We wanted to have a place where people could come and gather and strengthen the ties of the community. And then the last goal was to be an economic driver for the redevelopment of our community and our downtown specifically. So did we reach the goals? I would like to say that we did, and we still are. So we've had a lot of community impact, and I'll talk a bit about that. I mentioned in the beginning, people didn't like this idea, thought it was a stupid idea, but over time, a lot of people have changed their minds. So the majority of people in Wilson are very proud of the Whirligig Park, of the Whirligigs. It's the place, you know, voted #1, you know, most loved place in all of Wilson, all these things. And when people have their family visiting, they take them to the Whirligig Park. And people, when I started in Wilson 14 years ago, people really did not believe that their downtown could turn around. They wanted downtown development to happen. They just didn't believe it could. It couldn't happen in their community. But that has changed too, and so now people see that happening and they're so proud of it. And so it has really helped community pride. And I'll talk about that at the end, but I think that's one of the best things about this entire project. Of course, we have lots of fun events. They're free and open to the public. We have concerts and weddings, and even someone I met the other day was having a sort of quasi-wake in the Whirligig Park because she was a descendant of the people who started the Watson Warehouse. And so it has been definitely an economic driver. Just to give you a few images of what some of the events in the Whirligig Park look like. We keep it active, we keep it fun. We hope you'll visit us during one of the events or anytime really, farmers and artisan markets. And of course, we're seeing lots more art and public art pop up all around our downtown now, which is great. We really wanted the Whirligigs to inspire that creativity that we know is in our community. And another thing is it has helped galvanize a group of young people. The Gig 360 is a subsidiary of the Whirligig Park, and it is a group of young professionals that are dedicated to helping fundraise for the maintenance of the Whirligigs. Plus, they do a lot of fun activities together, peer-to-peer learning, creating a culture of young living in Wilson. And if you live here in a similar community to Wilson, that's a rural community, having young professionals wanting to stay and live in your community is so important. And so it has helped galvanize that as well. Educational impact. Some of you might not know that we view the Whirligigs as an educational tool. Like I mentioned, you can learn about a whole lot of things from the Whirligigs, from sustainability to wind energy to physics. And so we worked with the Keenan Institute and A+ schools to create a curriculum that can be used across the state of North Carolina. It meets the North Carolina curriculum standards. And we have taught this curriculum to almost 100 teachers in Wilson County and 14 surrounding counties. People, they use this in the classroom, and then the kids learn about stuff, whether it's social studies or, you know, art and design or whatever, sustainability or wind power. And then they oftentimes take field trips, and then oftentimes they come back and visit again. So, and we want to keep expanding our educational outreach because we want to be an educational place for people from 2 to 102, right? So keep an eye on that and what we're doing there. And then I'll talk a little bit about the economic impact. I mentioned that investment in historic downtown Wilson was low when we first got started. It was less than $1 million a year. And every year, year over year, we have seen that grow. And you might wonder, like, well, how do you know this is related to the Whirligig Park? You know, how do you know that the Whirligig Park was the driver? I can tell you that the first building that got redeveloped in downtown Wilson, which was the old Hackney Wagon Company, got turned into a mixed-use project with apartments and commercial space. I was at a North Carolina Main Street conference, and I was standing in line for the social event to get barbecue or whatever, and I was standing next to a guy and struck up a conversation, and he said, "Oh, Wilson, isn't that where they're talking about doing the Whirligig Park?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And he said, "Well, I just started a new development company, and my dad happens to be on the North Carolina Arts Council board, and I think they just gave you a grant." And I said, "Yeah, they did. That's awesome. Thank you." He's actually originally from Goldsboro, too, the Cadis family. And so he said, "Well, maybe I need to come up to Wilson and look at buildings." And I said, "Come on up to Wilson and look at buildings." And so, long story short, a lot of conversations like that over time. People getting interested in Wilson because we were doing something different. We were doing something creative. We were doing something out of the box. You know, we started to get on national media and all that kind of stuff. Now, people are calling us nonstop. And, you know, old buildings, a lot worse than this sometimes, have been, you know, bought, or the people that currently own them have decided to invest in them, and they start looking, you know, really like they need a lot of TLC, but they end up looking like this, which happens to be the headquarters of our Wilson Economic Development Council. We're also getting a lot of huge redevelopment. For those of you who are familiar with Wilson, you will know that BB&T started in Wilson, and they had 2 big towers in Wilson. The towers, I don't know if I can, are the place where they're on the far edge here, closest to the seats here. That's where the tower sat. But what is there now is a 73,000 square foot, 3-story YMCA in our downtown. Behind it, a parking deck. Behind that, BB&T, now Truist, built their new building behind that, and that's full of, 1,000 workers. Behind that is a historic school that was renovated to be 58 apartments. Next to that, there's 26 townhomes going up, and under construction right now is this building that you see sort of wraps around the block, and that's called Centro, and that's going to have 240 apartments and 10,000 square feet of commercial on the first floor. So this block alone represents millions and millions of dollars of investment in our community. And so small and big projects alike are important. And again, we have people investing in our community, local people. This is a woman who was born and raised in Wilson. She moved all around the world. She lived in Belgium and everywhere else, and she and her husband started a brewery, and they decided to bring it back to Wilson. This is across from the park. This is another couple. They decided that they wanted to start a bakery. This is another artist right across from the park, because she makes these amazing, huge mosaic sculptures. Again, more artists opening their galleries. This is a company that makes their own hair care products, soaps, and that kind of thing. And again, a lot of this is in line with what Vollis did, right? Vollis was a maker too, making beer, making art, making personal care products. And so we love that. And that piece of community pride and that piece of people investing in their own community and creating jobs is the thing that I think is just the most encouraging about this project. And so there's one last thing I'll leave you with. The Whirligig Park has an unusual feature. Does anybody know what it is? So the Whirligig Park is a day-to-night experience. You saw a video of what the Whirligig Park looks like in the day, but in the evening, Vollis put reflectors, highway signs. He collected highway signs and he cut them up and he put them all over the Whirligigs. And so when you shine light on a highway sign, what does it do? It reflects light back to you, right? So when you look at these Whirligigs at night and you shine light on them, they look like they're lit up. And sometimes people even say, oh, how do you turn the button on so they light up? There's not actually lights on them. Or they also say, how do you turn them on so that they move? Only Mother Nature has that button. But I'll show you just really quickly this clip of what they look like at night. We don't have any music, but this is what they look like at night, all lit up. And so our park is open till midnight, and it opens at sunrise. So you are welcome anytime in historic downtown Wilson at the Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park. We hope to see you there, and thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to answer questions after we're done.
I don't know how smooth that transition was, but here we are.
I'm going to get this phone.
I've noticed some of the people out here. I know some of you faces. You might not know that I know who you are, but I do. I'm Keith Barnes. I'm from Wilson. Been there forever. Probably continue there. Now that Kimberly's told you a little about Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park, I want to briefly introduce Mr. Simpson to you, more about him than the park. And I do want to clarify one thing. The 15 or 20 seconds you saw and heard Vollis is not the true Vollis. He was a fun-loving fellow. He seemed a little bitter in these, I thought. I didn't shoot the footage. It was shot 8 or 10 years ago, I guess, when that was done. Anyway, he had all sorts of personalities, but he was mostly a fun-loving guy, and I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. That doesn't make me anything special, but anybody that spent time with Vollis saw some fun. He had some of that too, but he was a character. Let me leave it like that. Said I knew a lot of people. I'm going to do one thing here. I'm going a little off the notes. Joe, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to recognize somebody. Does anybody know Mr. Joe Marm? Okay. Stand up just one time. I've known Joe a pretty good while. Won't get into all the details, but he's only a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. So when we get to recognize him, I like to do that. I'm sorry I embarrassed you. Just pointing that out. Thanks for being here tonight. Good to see you again, Joe. As Kimberly told you, she spoke a little and showed a little about Vollis. He gained worldwide fame using his welding and metalworking skills, along with a fantastic imagination to build the large whimsical contraptions that he, mostly out of scrap metal, as she pointed out. They became known as whirligigs. I will tell you, though, in his lifetime, he never called them whirligigs. They were windmills. So if I happen to throw out the term windmills, that's because there's not a confusion. It's just it was called two different things throughout the years. Anyway, the book that you're going to have available out front is a result of several years spent compiling facts and photos related to Vollis, many of which came about when I was with the Wilson Daily Times, as she explained earlier. And the book covers some highlights of his life, but the basic highlights, but it also serves as a behind-the-scenes look, telling more about what made him tick. He was colorful and unusual. His story goes far beyond just being a builder of whirligigs. We tried in this book to point out things like his earlier years prior to what he did. Now, she said something, he moved houses, he moved tobacco barns, heavyweight work. But we'll cover things like the early years prior to the whirligigs, his family, his dogs, sense of humor, outside interests, favorite foods, thoughts and opinions on a number of other things. He was born into a farming family, as was pointed out earlier, near Lucama in 1919. And his early years were spent like most people on a farm during that time. They were tough. But everybody's life was the same. It was hard work on the farm. After his high school at Lucama, he joined the Army Air Corps. And he went to Saipan during World War II, returning home in 45. That's when, several years after that, he married Jean Barnes. I'm not related to Jean, but he married Jean Barnes in 1947. And they moved in the home that his mother and father had lived in. They lived together there. This is Jean and Vollis, handsome couple back then. They farmed for about a year or so, although his heart was never really into farming. Not farming per se, not plowing every day and getting the crops in and being worn out at the end of the day. So, but still, those early years were valuable. Growing up in a farming environment gave Vollis a background and working knowledge of what farmers needed to keep their operations running smoothly. And a lot of that was heavy lifting and welding. Okay, there. Matter of fact, this, I'll tell you something about this. This was one of his records that he built. He built, I think, 17 of those in his career. I couldn't build one. I don't know how somebody builds a record not being, he just built those because he probably couldn't afford to buy one. He didn't like to spend a lot of money. But he made a lot of his things like this. That record still exists at his old home place, by the way. When he opened his, in 1951, he wasn't going to be a full-time farmer. He wanted to get out of farming, so he built a shop. There it is, a nice, neat place. He built, it looks worse than that, really. As you'll see, it's Simpson Repair Shop. Now, you can't see it in this picture, but out in front of that and out this way is where he built the whirligigs. But anyway, let's get back to the shop. He got really good at moving houses and moving tobacco barns and pulling tractors out of muddy fields, and that type of stuff that farmers had to have, but not everybody could do it, but Vollis could. And he became a very good welder. When the tractors would break, we're getting to the actual stuff here now. Of course, you can see some of his whirligigs starting to take shape too. He learned to weld pretty good. Oh, there you go. There's a good picture of him. And he got so good at it that he took up a hobby of building whirligigs. He had no schooling in how to build whirligigs. He had no training. It was strictly a hobby. That's how that happened, a hobby. Gene said he started tinkering, and that's what he was doing. He was tinkering. But he tinkered with, not tinker toys, but 1,000-pound items. Now, he started tinkering. He was still working as they're his hands, by the way. He still worked as moving tobacco barns and welding pieces together, but he started doing more of this stuff. And he started building things that people had never seen. He didn't have any plans to go by. It was a hobby. Very grueling hobby, but he just liked doing it. His only reason in building these things ever was just for smiles. He liked people seeing these things spin around in the wind. And to take the metal items that he was using and to make them so they just spin like a little a pinwheel you get at the fair. It's amazing how he did things. As I said, no plans, no formal training, no knowledge. Or he had knowledge, but he didn't gain knowledge by going to classes and learning about physics. So he built these things just for people to look at. That's the only reason he ever built them. He liked to look at them. He liked people to smile when they saw them. So that's how it worked. And he called them windmills, like I said. He started erecting them out there in the field. Well, here, as I said, some of these things were 60 feet tall. You've seen some in the background. Some are 60 feet tall and weighed 8 tons. Now, how do you do that? He did this when he got into his 60s. That was his hobby when he was in his 60s, of erecting steel. You'll see some of them. In these pictures, he's actually in his 80s. So he'd been doing them a while in some of these pictures. But that's what he did for a hobby. But now getting back to regressing a little, Mike Simpson, his son, said probably what really was the cause of this stuff ever happening was in the 1970s when we had the energy crisis, gasoline shortage, and Vollis was the kind that liked to cut corners if he could, or save money if he could, or if something didn't work, he'd figure out how to make it work. So when the fuel went sky high, most of us remember that, he built a heater, boiler, wood stove unit for their house. Well, after about a year, it worked fine, but it was kind of tough controlling the temperature in it. The wife, Jean, finally had enough. And she said, you got to move that thing. It was right outside the bathroom window. Matter of fact, no, it's not this one. It's one of the big ones that's at the park now. It was actually the first one that he built. He didn't plan to build it, but Gene said he couldn't have it at the house, so he moved it to this place. It's right near that right there, matter of fact. Okay, so he moved there, and one thing led to another. As he said a while ago, I think he said every weekend for 10 years. And there's some of the things he used. Now, how do you get something to spin in the wind? This is just a sample. It gets a lot worse than this. I mean, he had, for instance, he didn't buy any of these things. He, once in a while, had to come close to buying it, but he had a lot of people that were looking out for him. They knew what he collected, what he needed. Matter of fact, in Goldsboro, I don't remember the name of there was a junkyard in Goldsboro that he had 2 fellas who worked there that knew what he wanted. They might call, say, Vollis, we got 600 fans over here. He'd go get them. And from that, you get to see some of what he did. It was really dangerous around his shop. If you'll look, he's walking through that stuff, folks. He's not, there's no path there. It was very dangerous. But anyway, he spent some time doing one, well, have you got the one? Yeah, okay. This is when they started taking shape. That's 4 or 5 of them there. Remember, there's 30 of these in the park. He built these. As they grew and grew, and people started, neighbors were wondering what was he doing? They thought he was crazy. They said it was foolish for a grown man to be doing things like this. And he knew about the comments, but he wasn't deterred. I think it made him want to build them more. So anyway, gradually, as they were going up, and this is something you don't see out on a farm too often, as they were going up, pretty soon people started visiting the place. And word spread about the place. There's one of the visitors. But not just one visitor, there were thousands of visitors. Now keep in mind, there's no internet, there's no cell phones, there's no computers. They found this place, and they didn't live just in Goldsboro or Wilson. They lived in Russia, Japan, and places like that. They somehow found this place. Now, you know, if you looked up Whirligig Park now, you at least have a word search, you can start somewhere. They started from nowhere. How would you find out if you lived in Japan where this place was? It's not on a map. It got the name Acid Park. Well, it was a legendary name, so it's not listed on any brochures, any maps, but they found it, and they would show up there frequently. Some of you in here may have gone over there to Acid Park. Does anybody ever visit Acid Park when it was Acid Park? We got a few. Okay. And it was, now, around here it was feasible. You know, you'd heard about it. Somebody else had been to it, but how'd they find out all over the world? Anyway, everybody knew where it was. They found out how it was, and there was no GPS, nothing. But anyway, back to Acid Park. Now, what that signifies something bad, I'm assuming. Well, the name, it got its name from, one theory was, and this is sort of like a Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. There's no truth to this, but of course you spread a Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot and you see how many people go visit those places now, 6 or 7 million a year. And they've never seen a Loch Ness Monster or a Bigfoot, really. So anyway, Acid Park became popular. So here's how it got. One of the best versions, or the worst versions, whatever, said Vollis's daughter. This is, matter of fact, this is the. Hold it on that one just a second. The back one, yeah. That's the shop on the left, by the way, folks. Right there is the shop. And you see the Whirligigs going where they are out in front of his, to the side of his pasture. Well, the theory was that his daughter got killed in a wreck at the intersection here, and she had a bad LSD trip, which is, you got the Acid Park, that's the name. And she got killed there, and for 40 years, Vollis went crazy and started building these things in her memory. That's as true as the rest of them, not 1 ounce of truth in it. There are a lot of theories what happened. That was the one that was the favorite, though. Well, the daughter was Carol Simpson Kyles, who's still with us. She survived death, and she made it back. So anyway, Carol is still around. Matter of fact, Carol's on the board, on the Whirligig Park board. And she said some of the things that people made it were really whoppers. But anyway, she still lives just down there. Oh, by the way, this is called Windmill Road, and the dirt road there is called Vollis Shop Road. See, they still remember Vollis. This one was taken in about 2010, I think, when that shot was taken. Anyway, now, there are a number of chapters in here that discuss things we don't have time to go over, but we really got into some good things with him. His sense of humor was just amazing. If anybody knew him or spent time with him, you were thoroughly entertained before it was over with. I'm going to ask we'll cover some questions in a few minutes. But I'm going to throw out a couple things here that's not on my text, but I'm going to mention it. Does anybody know anybody else named Vollis? You won't find anybody named Vollis. If you look back in the years past, you won't find anybody named Vollis. He's it. If you take a word search and look under Vollis, it goes to Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park. His parents don't know how he got named Vollis. They did not know. His wife didn't know. No one in his family knew how he got the name Vollis. So I'm just telling you a fact there that doesn't make sense, but the only other Vollis that we know of is his son. That's it. But anyway, that was one of the strangest things of all of this. Now, this shot, I've gotten off track here a little too. This is when they moved some of these things from where they were to the downtown area. They restored them. Was it 8 years, Kimberly, I think? 8 years to restore them. And it's not really far from where you just saw that picture, from the Whirligig Park. But they restored them over 8 years, and they had to move all those that you saw downtown. Now, not only move them, they didn't just move them and throw them in a pile. They moved them, and every item in there was redone, thoroughly redone. It couldn't have lasted. These weren't built to turn into something like this. They were built totally for pleasure, and when he built them, as I said, he had no plans to go by. He also left no plans. There was no point in it. Why would he leave plans for something he's building out for? So what they took was all these items that you saw and restored them. And she mentioned a few names, and there was a lot of other names that were in that too, and they really did a fantastic job. I don't know how in the world they did it, but they worked it out somehow, and there they are. So, and they did maintain what they had. The same colors that they were at his home, or that they're the same colors today. And that's amazing that happened. Anyway, and by the way, those stories about the daughter getting killed, they're still out there. I hear them frequently, every week. Somebody wants to tell me, why didn't I put something in the book about the daughter that got killed? So anyway, I was told 20 minutes too. I'll do what I can. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Because something like this leaves a lot of questions. I feel sure. And ask anything you want. I'll do what I can, and Kimberly will do the same.
Okay, and if you'll, can you hear me back there? Can you hear me? Okay. If you will, raise your hand and speak in the microphone so we can get this recorded and everybody can hear.
I don't know how fragile these things are, but what do you do when you have a hurricane coming?
That's not a bad question.
Thank you.
Well, a hurricane would probably damage those like it would anything. I mean, they're not made to withstand a hurricane, I can tell you that, but they're made to withstand just about anything else. They're very well made, but as Vollis used to say, you got to keep them greased. He always said that. But a 20-mile-an-hour wind, actually less than that, but a 20-mile-an-hour wind, you think they're going to take off and fly. If you've not been to see it during a heavy wind, I'd recommend doing it, because it's something you won't forget. But as far as a hurricane, I don't think those or buildings would last. But they don't do bad. They're maintained pretty well. There's a good staff that still works on them. They're part of the park. But they have to climb those poles. These are folks our age, so they have to climb these poles. It's dangerous work. But they climb the poles, and they keep them working. And I don't know if that answers your question, but they're very well made. Well, they've had to tie some spots down. Yes, they have. They do. They don't tie all of them down, but there are some that are very dangerous. It's not simple stuff. It's very, like I said, the one that you saw a minute ago, when they were moving it, that one is a 16,000 pounder. At times they have to tie them down. but not, it's not, you don't go through with the sensation that there are ropes everywhere. It's just if it gets that tough, it's okay.
I just wanted to congratulate you on the vision that you had to be able to do this, that with the tobacco warehouses going away, then BB&T moving out of town, something like this project, I'm sure did a lot to revitalize not only downtown, but Kinston. I mean, I thought of Kinston because Kinston had similar kind of situations, and Kinston's really struggling right now. Wilson is doing, I think, very well. Our Golden K Kiwanis group went to see the Whirligigs, and we went through the museum and the gift shop, and we really enjoyed being there, and we appreciated the tour that we received there. And we also ate barbecue in Wilson, and I have to tell you though, being community-minded here in Goldsboro, Wilbur's is better barbecue. You just have to kind of admit that now.
Anybody on this side?
I'll tell you one thing, I've eaten at all the barbecue restaurants east of Raleigh, and they're all good. So that's what I'll say about that diplomatically. But Wilbur's is one of the good ones there.
And if you will, direct your question to who you'd like to answer.
Well, I want to ask Keith or Kimberly about the chair. We have to know about the chair.
Okay, ready? We ready to talk about the chair? You saw a few of Vollis working in the shop. In the latter part of his career, when he got into his 80s, when he just been, he was getting older and his feet and legs were hurting like anybody else's. He could do some welding and cutting of steel while seated. He didn't have to stand up. He did a lot of what you see here and while sitting down, amazingly. This is the chair was out in front of his shop. But the story on the chair, okay, first of all, we've established he could sit in the chair. I told you he liked to save money. Mike said one day, and his son worked with him for 21 years. Mike said one day somebody came by and threw it out in the yard, out of the back of a pickup truck, threw it over there, and didn't say anything, just threw it over there. Vollis went and got it, and it lasted for 20 years, just like that. It's put together about as ragged as you can imagine. It's got nails stuck in all different places. You see but there, he did no painting of it. That was the original paint. But he worked out of that chair, and that was typical of him right there. That's a perfect example of the things. Now, he produced these, but he did a lot of work in his late years. She mentioned Burke Uzzle a while ago. Burke's a world-famous photographer. He spent a half a day working on that picture of that chair. And it's a big-time print in the archives in Washington, D.C. But anyway, that's the story of that chair, and it started as nothing, it ended as nothing, but what a life it had. That's going to be on display in the museum. It's just got to have a place built around it so nobody can go happen to sit in it or throw it away or something like that. Okay.
I have a second question that I'll direct to Kimberly, but you may answer it too. Kimberly, was there a plan? How did you decide the placement of the pieces?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so we did think a lot about this, okay, we get these whirligigs, we build the park, where are we going to put them in the park? How are we going to arrange them in the park? Are they going to be by theme, by, what size, what? And what we ended up doing, one of our guiding principles, and we had these on sticky notes around the conservation headquarters too, we had just little notes to ourselves that said, WWVD, what would Vollis do? And so when we were designing the park, if you remember the land that the Whirligig sat on Vollis's field, it's about 2 acres. In the middle, there's a pond, right? Well, we don't have a pond in the middle of the Whirligig Park, but we do have a green that's shaped similar to the pond. And we ended up deciding, why don't we just arrange them around the green in roughly the same way that Vollis had them arranged around the pond, you know, so how better than to put them in the same order that the artist put them himself. And in fact, the park is that green kind of to represent the pond, and then we did a lot too in the park design to echo the history of the tobacco warehouse and the tobacco industry that was in Wilson. So the bricks in the park are from tobacco warehouses that had been lost. The ordering system, which is a bunch of squares, are reminiscent of if you had been in a tobacco warehouse to see the rows of tobacco or even rows of any crop, you know, growing. So there's a lot of things like that. The shelter in the park mimics the roof lines of tobacco warehouses. So just a lot of things like that. We were trying to kind of go back to the original site, you know, where they were in situ, as well as, you know, kind of the history of tobacco in downtown. So.
Okay. I have two questions. Kimberly, I'll ask you first. Are any of the artwork for sale? I mean, where do you, if you wanted one of these, where would you buy it?
Good luck. The Whirligig Park and Museum, we did acquire 31 of the large-scale whirligigs as well as many of the smaller works. They range from, you know, this size to this size, and those are in our permanent collection, all but one, which went to the Kohler Institute in Wisconsin. Because they were one of our major funders for conservation, and so that also drives visitors to us as well. But they are hard to come by. Sometimes you can find them for auction at like Leland Little or in different places they'll show up, or sometimes even on Facebook Marketplace or things like that. So it's hard to buy them now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, there aren't any more original Vollis's being made.
Okay,
So.
right. Keith,
Go ahead.
well, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So if they didn't know where Vollis's name came from, what was his real name?
It was Vollis.
Oh, okay, so his parents just made it up.
They don't know. I know that sounds rich. Jean, I spent a lot of time with Jean, and I've asked that question so many times. She has no idea. I said, well, didn't his parents know? She said, no, they never could tell me how he got named or why he got named Vollis. So I'm assuming somewhere along the way they made up a birth certificate. I don't know, but they don't know either.
Keith,
Nobody knows.
Well, they
can you
did have
tell
a
him
lot
what
of
his
kids.
sister's name was?
It gets even worse. Vollis is not bad enough, but he had a sister. Her name was Void, as in null and void. And they don't know where that name came from. It's a lot of fun, folks. I can tell you, it's a lot of fun.
We'll take this question from Doc and then one more, and then we'll.
Okay.
I have two questions too. Keith, is it possible that Vollis started off as a world-class hoarder and then had an epiphany that this is what he was going to do with all this stuff that he had collected?
A lot of big words there. His only goal was just pleasing folks with his hobby. That's his only goal. He never knew, first of all, that there would ever be a monetary value of these things. He didn't know that they'd ever be sold for anything. There was no point in that. It was just, if you got your Tinker's toys out when you're 7 or 8, it made things, that was the whole idea behind it. But it's an amazing story, how it all happened. Everything had to fall into place, not just through the economic stuff that she covered earlier, but lots of things had to fall into place for this. First of all, he worked 30 or 40 years on these. Now, it'll never be done again, not like this. There's no way it could be done again. When you tell somebody get out of college and you're going to be working for 30 or 40 years, but you won't receive any money until the 40 years over, then we might not have anything. That's what they faced. What they've accomplished, her group, and all, there's a lot of names in that group, they really accomplished something that's it seems impossible that they did what they did.
Absolutely.
But as far as the name, I can't.
Sure.
Okay.
Kimberly, you said the Simpson family still owns the Whirligigs?
No, the Whirligigs in the park and the ones in the museum are owned by the nonprofit. There
Okay.
are a couple of whirligigs that are still out by the shop, across from the shop. I don't think there are any in the field, but those are owned by the Simpson family. Yeah.
And this will be the last question. Please come ask them something if you'd like to stay.
Did Vollis or his son say what was the most expensive one he ever sold? I know they went to Russia and all over the world.
Well,
He
some of
has
them were
right?
donated, that the ones that you're
He-
talking, at the museums and things. I don't know for sure what they were, and I've never known that. No, he didn't look at it that way. It took a while before, he didn't make anything to sell. What reason that he ever sold anything, large or small, some of you have seen little miniatures and there's some in the museum. The only reason they came about is because people kept visiting his shop, people from wherever. They wanted more than just a handshake or a picture. They wanted a souvenir. So he started making some small ones. Well, it got out of hand. They would tell him, well, I need 2 of these or 10 of these. Anyway, he could make them pretty quick, but he didn't know that. That was well into his career. That was in the 1990s, long after he had built all these other things. He said, well, I might as well try making a few dollars if they want to buy them. And that's where the selling of the thing started. But as far as, they didn't keep a log of who sold what for how much. That some people would know some of that, and I know some of it, but there's no point in discussing what one sold for, but some of them were very expensive. Vollis said it took as long or much to do a small one as it did to make a big one, because you still got to, there's more to it than if you don't think it, just try building one of these things one time. There's some of the small ones like this are very expensive, and I think you said good luck on how to get one. There's not many out there.
We do make, our conservation team does make small ones that we sell in the museum, but they're not Vollis originals. But they are our conservation team originals. And you can also commission them from our conservation team.
That would be fun. We have one in Goldsboro, correct?
You do have one in Goldsboro. It needs some love. We need to
Yes.
talk to those folks, and we could help them out.
Well, we thank you both so much for coming. This was great. I did want to tell you that the foundation is offering a field trip to the Whirligig Park on April the 12th. And we'll get there, arrive at 11 o'clock, and we'll have Henry Walston, who knows y'all very well, and he will be giving the tour. There is limited, I guess, amount of people who can go, and then we'll go take the walking tour and then go to Parker's Barbecue. So if you are interested in that at all, you need to get with Adrian, Emily, or Wendy in the foundation office and sign up. But I think seats are going fast, so please sign up if you can. Yes, sir. Oh, absolutely, with the reflectors and all. Y'all have been marvelous.
And we'll have the books out.
And we're going to have books outside. The Whirligig Park brought them for sale, and Keith will be down there to sign those. So y'all have a wonderful night. Hope to see you next Monday at 5:30, same place.
Thank you, folks.
Tommy Jarrett's talk on the vice presidency. It'll be great.